Most hardcore. Some of them talk, but lacking in character. How can I relax when it's theft of innocence? The harmless are broken. Oh, what tragedy to meet death with the lost word unspoken. Hide it behind the foundations. Charity constructed house of euthanasia. Architects of house of cards remain hidden behind one noble cause. Extravagant facade masquerading as God. I don't buy it at all. I like the real thing raw. I tell the whole veil off. The lights on or off. I get mine either way. The stellar man in effect, I'll leave you free and breathless like true psychedelic acceptance. Worldview becomes transcendent. This midnight smoke is so high octane, paralyzing the presence. Hello everyone and welcome to This Week in Tyranny, the most hardcore news show on earth. I am your host Conrad Rogas, welcoming you to episode 50 of This Week in Tyranny. Today is Saturday, November 18th, 2023. I'll begin by saying there was no video last week on YouTube where you may be viewing me. That does not mean there wasn't a show last week. There was a show. There was no YouTube show because I received a strike on my channel and was suspended for a week. It is the first and probably not the last. So just want to let everybody know I was not able to post or let anybody know other than on my website, truthandlaw.com or onegreatworknetwork.com. I had it posted there. But if you don't see a video for a week, unless that means either I'm dead, imprisoned, or my channel is suspended somewhere. This Week in Tyranny will be done every week, no matter what, as long as I'm able to do it. So that is just for the future, for if and when this happens again. Probably won't happen this episode though, because this episode is about climate attribution science. Yes, it's a bit of a thing that you can still talk about freely and disagree with the mainstream. So, to introduce the video, there were two main stories this week. It seems like it's every week we have these main stories. The first one, Israel and Hamas. I won't be talking about that. And the second story is the climate. So we're talking about wildfires, heat waves, extreme weather, record-breaking temperatures. This is a very loud, big story, week in and week out. And news has come out, of course, this is going to be the hottest year on record. That is what they are predicting with 99% certainty. So let me jump right into it. Climate science is collectivist science. It's based on the premise that the biochemical activity of all humans can be determined and controlled by a select group of individuals. Now, collectivism, of course, is a cult belief. It's not real science. And this episode will be a scientific rejection of collectivism, debunking of this pseudoscience, if you will. So this is a response to all the climate news that is out there. And let's get right into it. Climate attribution science, or climate change attribution, attempts to link climate change and weather patterns to human activity. Now that's about proving causality, is what they're attempting to do, which is mathematically a very difficult thing to do, because there are three requirements for establishing statistical causality. Statistical causality, you need to have 1, temporal sequencing, which is that X must come before Y. That's first. Second is non-spurious relationship, which means the relationship between X and Y cannot occur by chance alone. And third, the most important, is eliminate alternate causes. So there are no other intervening or unaccounted for variable that is responsible for the relationship between X and Y. That is what you need to prove if you want to say this causes that. That is what you need to prove if you want to say that human activity causes climate change. So let's talk about the methods of climate attribution science and then revisit these three mathematical prerequisites. Now, the reason I'm addressing attribution science like this in a scientific way is because it's a relatively new area and many people don't know about it yet. And you'll be hearing more about it soon. and I want to blow the whistle on it. I want to meet the tyranny in the street, as I like to say. If tyranny is not at your doorstep, that's because there's someone in the street keeping it at bay. That's what I used to say. And this is it. The best way to counter misinformation and propaganda is to address it while it's in its formative stages. And this is that. So we're going to address it. So let's define and familiarize ourselves with the subject. Climate attribution science. Now, I'm going to do this by referencing Congressional Report R47583. This is by the Congressional Research Service. The Congressional Research Service is a public policy research institute for the U.S. Congress. So their job is to provide legislators with accurate information, right? This report was prepared by Jonathan Haskett, who is a research scholar at Johns Hopkins University. And this report is dated June 1st, 2023, only a few months ago, and it's entitled, "Is That Climate Change? The Science of Extreme Event Attribution." So, from that study, from that congressional report, it's not a study, it's a congressional report based on studies. Climate change attribution is the study of whether or to what degree human influence may have contributed to extreme climate or weather events. Scientists can now estimate whether human activities have influenced extreme weather or climate events and change how likely they are to occur. This is known as the science of climate change attribution. The interpretation and evaluation of attribution findings have been part of the discussion of policy on wildfires, heat waves, climate change, and disaster responses, among other issues. Understanding the attribution process and its uncertainties may be helpful in understanding the potential uses and limitations of climate attribution claims. So analyzing that text, wildfires and heat waves are the first thing mentioned. And it's interesting, this summer we had the wildfire smoke in late June, early July. At that time it was here in Chicago, smoke everywhere, all over the country. Then July was the hottest month on record. You've seen these reports come out. Then we had the Maui wildfires in August in Hawaii. Very tragic. And this congressional report, though, is dated June 1st. So before this, it's eerily prophetic in listing wildfires, heat waves, climate change, and disaster responses, because that occurred within the next 2 months. And just earlier this week, news came out of Brazil. The heat wave over there is bringing the heat index up to 137.3 degrees. Big scorching heat in Brazil. And it's remarkable that all these things would happen, all of them, after the discussions on the topic of climate change have intensified. Extreme weather events have intensified. And of course, I will present the link between these things towards the end of the episode. Back to the reading, they said understanding the attribution process and its uncertainties may be helpful in understanding the potential uses and limitations of climate attribution claims. Potential uses of climate attribution claims. Why does that sound a little bit off? Because what they mean is, how can you use these claims? How can you exploit these climate events? They are showing the members of Congress how to capitalize on disasters. That's what's going on here. How to capitalize on disasters with the help of climate attribution science. That's its function in this scenario. And they mention extreme weather events, so let's focus in on disasters in particular, as opposed to long-term climate shifts. Now, it's well understood that impactful laws are proposed, passed, and implemented in times of crisis, shortly after disasters and tragedies and events of mass death. That's how it's done, and the most basic and simple reason for this is due to political contributions, which is a soft way of saying lobbying, which in itself is a soft way to say bribery. Politicians are paid for or bribed. This is legally paid for or bribed to propose, to promote, to vote for specific laws. Disasters then, natural or man-made, are opportunities for politicians to exert the influence that they were already paid for, the influence that they owe somebody. This is about owing people favors, and this is what the supposed meritocracy of the American Republic has become. It is favors for political influence. To a degree it always has been, but really this just speaks to the collectivism and how it has infiltrated the American way of life, the American government as well. So natural disasters then are payday. They're just payday for members of Congress and media and other non-politicians. That's when they cash in. And this congressional report then goes into these disasters specifically. And the headline of this section is Extreme Event Attribution. Extreme event attribution is a specific type of climate change attribution. Multiple approaches to extreme event attribution have been developed. A recent review of this field identified two principal types of extreme event attribution analysis. One, the risk-based approach, and two, the storyline approach. Yes, the phrase storyline approach is officially stated in the United States government's congressional reports. And indeed, this is what we hear from the mayors, from the governors, from the police chiefs, from the president on TV. We hear the storyline approach. They present us with the storyline that will create public support. Support for what? Collectivism, which is what I will discuss later at the end of this episode. So how does it work? The science, the methodology of attribution science. Let's talk about it, and this is according to worldweatherattribution.org, which is partnered with the Imperial College of London. I think a much better term than partnered with would be created by. And my personal opinion is that the Imperial College of London and other established institutions created this organization as part of a public marketing decision to keep climate change science separate from government-funded institutions. And their first YouTube video was uploaded 5 days ago at the time of recording this show. But let's go with their own words. They're partnered with the Imperial College of London, according to worldweatherattribution.org. What they say is about their method. This is what they say about their method, how they actually go about the science. What does their science consist of? What is their scientific method? Quote, by analyzing observed real-world weather data collected from weather stations in the study region, researchers can find out how unlikely the extreme weather event is and identify any trends in the intensity of similar events. So far so good. Observation, recording data. Let's go on. Further analysis can then determine how frequently weather events of a similar intensity would have been expected to occur before humans started burning fossil fuels in the late 1800s, which means the researchers can calculate the difference in the probability of an event occurring in the late 1800s compared to the probability of an event occurring today. Fine, this is still science, but a presumption has now entered the picture. And the presumption is that in the late 1800s, humans beginning to burn fossil fuels is the only thing that occurred in that time period. That is the assumption they're making. So by choosing that specific time marker to organize the data, you are fishing for a particular outcome, right? But explaining why weather 150 years ago is different than weather today, that's a whole different story. And there is no scientific basis for it so far, just based on this method. Not yet. But, that can pass for science. That is still scientifically correct so far. And that's part one of their methodology. This is part two. Quote, the second part of the study uses computer modeling to try to isolate the role of human-induced climate change in the event. Researchers use modeling that simulates the likelihood and intensity of the weather event in two worlds, quotations. Today's world, with 1.2 Celsius of human-induced global warming, and a hypothetical world without human-caused climate change. Researchers then compared the results to find out if climate change made the event more or less likely and intense. Now this is not science at all. First of all, computer modeling is fine. It's powerful, it can be useful. But to base any scientific conclusions on it, you have to make sure it meets the statistical criteria for causality. The quote uses computer modeling to try to isolate the role of human-induced climate change. Forget trying to isolate the role of it. Human-induced climate change, you have to prove it exists first. Human-induced meaning human cause. So what are the criteria for proving cause? 1, you have to show that the invention of the combustion engine in 1876 came before any climate change. Climate change meaning increase in global temperature. And you can't do that conclusively because you don't have a large enough data set to rule it out. But let's go with it. Let's go with that and say you've done that successfully, right? You have to prove number 2. You have to show that the relationship between climate change and carbon burning did not occur by chance alone. And to do that, you would need to have knowledge of long-term natural climate patterns, which we do not. And you would have to show that the current climate is not consistent with that pattern that you would have known. So we can't do that, but let's assume that is the case and say that we proved it and see if we can satisfy the last requirement. 3, and most importantly, you have to show that there are no other intervening or unaccounted for variables that are responsible for the relationship between climate change and humans burning carbon. Can you do this? No, you can't. You can't do this. There are infinite variables. But here are some variables that I would propose for analysis, my personal ones. Number 1, electromagnetic radiation. And the first radio transmission, the first example of electromagnetic radiation being, globally implemented, was made in 1895. That's around the late 1800s, right? That's around the time of so-called, fossil fuels being burned. And by 1905, radio transmission reaches a wide audience. And of course, since then, wireless communication has become exponentially more powerful since, especially since the 90s, when all the phones and the Wi-Fi wireless communication and the internet has really, changed this world. And that's right around the time we started hearing about climate change. So that is one variable to be explored as far as how those electromagnetic frequencies alter sunlight coming from the earth, gases evaporating from the surface into the atmosphere. There's a lot to look at there. Now, number 2 of my variables that I propose is nuclear detonation. The first nuclear bomb was detonated in 1945, and nuclear testing was then widespread in the 1960s. And I'd like to show this study by Clay Hansen entitled Underground Nuclear Testing, the Leading Cause of Global Warming. And he has a book which I've bought, which I'm waiting to be delivered. I'm looking forward to investigating this. But there's a lot to this nuclear detonation, and you can match it up with the charts of the global temperature. And my third variable is the war, the suffering, the mass death, the incredibly tragic butchery and barbarism and torture that was the 1900s. The 20th century was the most murderous in recorded history. The total number of deaths caused by or associated with wars have been estimated at 187 million in that 100 years. And that's the equivalent of more than 10% of the world's population in 1913. So taken as having begun in 1914, when World War I begins, it was a century of almost unbroken war, with few and brief periods of organized armed conflict somewhere. And it was dominated by world wars, meaning wars between territorial states or alliances of states. So there was more death, and there's more that is not even noted. It was death everywhere. Now you may ask what this has to do with weather, and the answer is that science has yet to thoroughly study the effect of the quality of life and the relationship between the human condition and the condition of the earth and its climate. And what we call mysticism and mystery today is only a law of nature not yet discovered by science. And in fact, scientists are beginning and have begun to investigate this link between the mind, the body, and the world at large. And one example, of course, is Dr. Bruce Lipton and his best-known work, The Wisdom of Your Cells. But speaking of the quality of life, here's a graph of the tax rates in the last 100 years, in America at least. So look at that with the global temperature and see those two graphs. It also spikes during World War II and increases rapidly in the 1960s. And that's not an example of correlation not proving causation. I'm bringing that up for serious consideration, for the connection between how hot the earth is and how much theft occurs in the world, how many resources are taken from people under coercion, meaning the implied threat of violence, meaning against their will. And those are just some variables that climate attribution science cannot account for, and therefore this second part of their methodology is pseudoscience. According to them, the results from the real world data and models results are combined to provide an overarching statement about how climate change influences the intensity and likelihood of the weather event. Now, having just analyzed this, it's apparent what they're really saying and what I just read. WorldWeatherAttribution.org and the Imperial College of London are saying that they combine real science with their own results based on their assumptions and their preconceived notions, and combine that to provide an overarching statement. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is called pseudoscience. And speaking of pseudoscience, and on the topic of attributing causality, I'd like to talk about an aforementioned Imperial College of London and pseudoscience through computer models, right? And let's see if we can establish some kind of a link between those two. Let's see if those two are linked causally. What do I mean by this? Computer models being taken seriously as a basis for global action, that's kind of a novel concept. That's pretty new. It's a novel concept, and it did not exist before the novel coronavirus of 2019. And the best known and the most impactful of these computer models and the conclusions that they presented was the one of Neil Ferguson. And that's Professor Neil Ferguson, officer of the Order of the British Empire, head of the Institute for Disease and Emergency Analytics, director of the Center for Global Infectious Disease Analysis, and head of the Department of Infectious Disease Epidemiology. All three of those institutions he leads are all at the Imperial College of London. And he has an impressive set of titles. Let's look if he has an equally impressive record and see if we can find a link between those two. 2001, foot and mouth disease outbreak in the United Kingdom. He was part of a team that worked on computer models to inform the government. Ferguson published a journal article in the Science magazine in April 2001, describing the mathematical models that were relied on by the UK government to recommend the mass slaughter of millions of cows, sheep, and pigs in the UK in order to stop the spread of the disease. That was 2001. 2005, bird flu. Neil Ferguson said in an interview that the bird flu could kill as many as 200 million people worldwide. He warned that failure to take swift action would be catastrophic for the United Kingdom, saying, quote, "If the virus got as far as Britain, it would effectively be too late." The virus did not reach Britain, and 74 people worldwide died of bird flu in 2005. 2009, swine flu. Ferguson recommended that to halt the transmission of swine flu, actions would need to be including treating isolated cases with antivirals, public health measures such as school closures, travel restrictions around the region, mass use of antiviral prophylaxis in the population, and possible use of vaccines. For a virus, by the way. Vaccines for a virus. And prophylactic antiviral medication. We haven't heard that before. We haven't heard that in the last century. Many older scientists are watching this, you remember. He was also asked then why there was not a policy for vaccinating frontline healthcare workers at the time. And he answered that question, and he answered that there's an intense debate regarding the ethical issues of advanced use of vaccines due to adverse health effects and due to cost-benefit analysis. What does that answer mean? In other words, he said he would do it and he would endorse it, if not for the resistance to it. There was a debate at the time. The debate has died down since then, in the mainstream at least. It hasn't died down on This Week in Tyranny. And then, of course, 2020, COVID-19. And this is how he became famous, really. Neil Ferguson headed the Imperial College COVID-19 response team. If that sounds familiar, it is. He was basically the English Anthony Fauci. And him and his team developed the epidemiological model called COVID-SIM. Simming the COVID, they did COVID-SIM. You've heard of SimCity, here's COVID-SIM. And on March 16, 2020, he published a report in which he claimed that 500,000 people would die in Great Britain and 2.2 million people would die in the United States by September, according to his report. Now the actual number at that time was 57,000 in the UK and 176,000 in the US. And those are the official statistics. And I won't really go into disputing their validity by talking about the testing accuracy or the reporting practices. I'll just take those numbers at face value. And at face value, the report underestimated the deaths by 10 times. It was 10% of what he said it was going to be. That report was March 16th. England went into lockdown March 23rd, a week later. America went into lockdown the same week. California on the 19th, Illinois on the 21st, and New York on the 22nd. Ferguson's proposed death tolls and the projected collapse of the healthcare system and medical infrastructure, they're based on the predictions that 81% of the population would become infected and 0.9% of them would die. And those predictions are based on the R0 value of 2.4. R0 is the reproduction number, which means that each person would infect 2.4 other people on average. That's what we're talking about. That is the value that made this whole thing happen. It's the R0 value. And this was based on the early growth rate of the epidemic in Wuhan. And here's where the science became pseudoscience, because a reproduction number is not a constant, could never be a constant. It is not a constant, but a changing variable that decreases with time, because as more people become infected, as infection spreads, the population of uninfected people decreases, meaning the pool is now smaller, right? Meaning it approaches zero very quickly, like it has in China. Not perpetually infecting people by a value recorded at the peak of the outbreak, where nobody was infected. You can read his report, it's still up, you could read it for yourself and see for yourself all of the whimsical, arbitrary assumptions that were put into this model. Assumptions like that a symptomatic person is 50% more infectious than an asymptomatic person. Where? Out of what? Like, where is that? Where is the scientific basis for that? And the assumption that 50% of households would disobey a home quarantine. How about that? And that was in England, where they, unfortunately, England does have a higher rate of obedience, for sure, than we do here in the States. But it seems like that's changing, isn't it? But while we're talking about disobeying quarantines, let's talk about Neil Ferguson today. For many people, his name and reputation is disgraced. Why is it disgraced? On the 5th of May 2020, it emerged that Ferguson had resigned from his position as a government advisor in the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies when it was revealed that he violated lockdown orders to meet with a married woman who was his lover. And basically, that's when he resigned. That's when his name kind of went away. That's when many people just started to trash him, especially in the alternative media. I recall that. Now, personally, I don't hold that against him at all. I don't think there's anything wrong with defying those orders for a consensual meeting. What I do hold against him is an R0 value of 2.4. I think it is a disgrace that an accomplished scientist would engage in such amateurish pseudoscience, and that the world-leading pandemic science and climate attribution science would get destroyed and debunked by a YouTuber from Chicago, 27-year-old construction worker, high school dropout. And what you just witnessed there is called a flawless victory. And that will conclude the scientific portion of this show. And now let's talk about what's in the hearts and minds of men, because that's more I'm really concerned with. Because you could disprove all the science and you still don't get through the hearts and the minds. So the questions: why is collectivist science pushed? Why do politicians get bribed to pass control measures? Why do the Neil Fergusons of the world reach the top of scientific institutions to do fake science? And why do media members and media platforms support the control measures and support the fake science? And the answer is, the world is under an occult web of control, a web with no name, no leader, and no headquarters. And the word collectivism describes it well. It's collectivism. Now, climate change attribution is just the latest pseudo-scientific term in the attempt to stop human production. Fossil fuels and greenhouse gases, they're just catchy terms with matching initials, Fossil fuels, greenhouse gases. They're terms that mask and cover what they're actually describing. They're describing the combustion engine. Collectivists want the end of the combustion engine. Why? Because the combustion engine has resulted in unprecedented freedom for human beings, freedom to move, freedom to obtain resources, freedom to acquire knowledge, the freedom to meet other people, the freedom to form relationships, to own property, to pursue fulfillment in the world, to go wherever they please. Collectivists today, ideologically speaking, they're the Nazis and communism. They're Nazis and communists of the last century. The collectivists want central planning, public transportation, surveillance, control of resources, control of nature, control of words, of thoughts, of ideas. They'd control emotions if they could, biochemically. Look out for that. This is why they create disasters, to evoke fear, which they exploit then to implement their controls. Hitler did it, Stalin did it, and they'll do it again. And they'll do it here in America. They have done it here in America. Freedom, knowledge, love, ability, competence, respect, dignity, these are the enemies of collectivism. Because the collectivists cannot produce. They're impotent. They're not men of honesty and integrity. They're men of theft and deception and brute force, if they can muster it, if they can get some golems to listen to their orders and follow their dictates. And they are at the top of society, not at the bottom. Because throughout human history, the standard way of life has been feudalism and slavery. But this changed. This changed with the free spread of ideas. It changed with movement, free motion, mass production, motion. Motion, a principle of nature, manifested in the invention known as the combustion engine. We are the fuel, the collectivists are the fossils, and we can send them with the fossils to go with the dinosaurs. Thank you.